today. We've got Meredith Doig, who's the president of the Rationalist Society, who's speaking later today. And we've got Tony Smith, who was just on during the break. And the panel topic name is Black Swans, Chaos and Emergence. So it's about complex systems.
Colin.
Colin.
Can I address this to all members of the panel? Complexity theory, very interesting. Complicated was mentioned by several people. The strict formal mathematical definition of complexity has been known since the mid-50s out of general information theory. Why do too few people mention the formal studies which have surrounded, embraced, given some good understandings of complexity theory? Why do we always say too hard, it's too complicated? It's well known, folks.
I believe it's because people, including the people who came to it in the 50s, each came from their own specific context. So we got things like second order cybernetics, we got extensions of systems theory and so on. So you get, it's been rediscovered from every perspective, and everybody who's rediscovered it tries to subsume it within their narrow reductionist speciality, and ultimately by doing so miss the point. So by saying it's well understood, any single view of it might be well understood, but the totality has been largely missed.
Can I add to that? You use two terms together, complexity and complicated. They're not the same thing.
Yeah.
We can have all sorts of problems that are complicated, but they are not complex. Complexity is specifically about those things that involve emergent behaviour, in my opinion. Yeah.
Colin, were you talking about the general public or the public that is interested in these sorts of issues anyway?
Well, I'm aiming a bit of unfriendly fire at the tyros of academia, from both the sciences and from the arts and humanities. In the sciences, they tend to ignore complexity theory. They leave it to people in information theory or in maths. From the humanities, they use the word complicated and use it for complex and don't really further.
Yeah, that's true. But if you had a panel here of people from the humanities faculty, they would probably complain that the people in the science faculty or the technology faculty don't understand the issues that they're talking about as well. So, which goes to your point, I think, Tony.
Yeah, and this is still a challenge. It's still early days.
Yeah.
People keep wanting to think we're near the answer.
I think an important point there, and Tony alluded to it, is that in fact no single discipline can actually deal with the issue of complexity. It is a multidisciplinary, it's something that lays across all disciplines, and any time we try to separate it out from any particular discipline, I think we actually lose an important facet of looking at a particular problem.
Can you talk more about how complexity theory actually relates to us as humans and society, and in general how we see ourselves and the universe?
In 5 minutes?
Just a little bit, something basic, just so you have an understanding of why we study it and what it says about us.
I think from my point of view, I came to looking at complexity, and I'll freely admit that, yes, I agree with Tony that we come at looking at complexity from the discipline with which we are viewing the problem. Mine came from the behaviour that happens when people try to manage entire disruptions to communities of large-scale disasters. I look at it from the point of view that when you take a group of individuals and you put them together and you face them with a complicated problem, because they each come to it with their own beliefs and their own worldviews and their own training, because training has a deep impact on how people solve problems, what you get is a complex response to a complicated situation. And that's my view of why I look at complexity and how I came eventually to this thing of looking at it in terms of the most successful enterprise on the planet, which is our own human enterprise. So it's, behaviour in the collective.
I think this is a really interesting question because it's sort of the person in the street question. Why does this matter to the person in the street? And I think it matters because even the person in the street who may not be an academic and may not even be interested in current affairs, but they are somehow interested in the meaning of life, what makes life meaningful for human beings. And I think complexity theory, which I am no expert in, so whatever I say may be a fairly naive description of complexity theory, but I think it starts to get beyond the idea that because what we see in life is so complex, so complicated, it must have a complex explanation. Or if it's too complex, then it's mystical somehow. And so you conclude, or the average person in the street may conclude, that it's beyond human beings, i.e. you get into the metaphysical ideas of God and religion and so on and so forth, as an explanation of the complexity of life and human life in particular in the universe. Why, to me, complexity theory is interesting is that it appears to me to be a bit of a doorway into imagining that ultimately we will be able to explain the inexplicable. I think, and that's useful to the person in the street. I mean, when we get to the point where we've got the language to explain the concepts in simple terms that the average person in the street can understand, then we have the possibility of moving beyond grasping at metaphysical explanations, religious explanations, mystical explanations of what seems to be inexplicable.
Yeah, I think the other thing that you need to bring to this discussion is why that there are tremendous biases in the way we think, that we kind of don't want to think about complexity. Now, this is for very good reasons. Basically, our brains have become a great repository for a lot of traces of the past. We have a whole lot of information through there. Our senses allow in a vast amount of information about the moment. Yet our capacity to act at any given time means we can normally only do one thing. So we have to be able to simplify all this input and act. And if we don't act, we don't survive. This is historically. Right now we get propped up, but over all of history, if we don't act, we don't survive. And therefore you've got this bias to be able to throw away, discard almost everything except this notion of cause and effect, this proximate cause that gives you a better than statistical chance of surviving getting the next meal or whatever. So we want simple answers because they're what gets us through the day, and they're what's always got us through the day. So we have a great problem, and at the moment complexity is still just an intellectual exercise, and this is, and there's the current anti-science, anti-intellectual movement that's out there makes it harder, but somehow, because we've got a set of complex problems, the simple problems are all solved. There aren't simple problems left to solve. There are complex problems left to solve, and we therefore need to get at least a critical mass of people in the community. Now, I believe out there's a whole lot of quite successful people who understand this stuff. They just aren't embedded in the theory. They're like N.N. Taleb, who writes a book about black swans and denies there is any theory. Because he doesn't know there's any theory. It's not in his world the theory that underpins it. And the theory is fragmented, as I've tried to point out. The theory's all over the place. It's everybody's different perspective. But that's the problem, is how do we get complexity into third grade? How do we get kids can we get them back out and doing nature study or something like that, and actually looking at the natural world? But everything we're doing is putting young people into a more automatic world where everything is, where cause and effect are hit them in the face before anything else does. And there's more to it than just cause and effect, that you've actually got to look at a whole lot of things.
I think associated with that, there's a close alignment between that issue and the issue of teaching general systems thinking.
Yeah, exactly.
And we don't teach general systems theory yet. It's been around for a damn long time.
Yeah, and that's where Marcia Salma's question came out of general systems theory. It's not just that, not specifically complexity, but it generalises to complexity and emergence. Patrick.
Yes. So this might seem a bit naive, but
Speak
what?
up.
Sorry. Cool. I've got a microphone. Hello.
Yeah.
Cool.
Good.
Okay. So, what exactly is complexity? Because I know two mathematical definitions which aren't equivalent. Hooray, mathematics! We're being as precise as ever. And I'm assuming that it's neither computational complexity nor Kolmogorov complexity. But, I mean, this is my understanding at least. Tell me if this is accurate. We've got some very complicated systems like biology, cellular automata, the brain, and so on. And we can't explain them with our general theories involving differential equations and simple cause and effect. Is that right? Or?
Yeah, it's, to me, part of the definition is it's where differential equations break down. And we've talked about not particularly non-linear systems as another direction people come in from, because as you well know, you can solve linear systems forever, but the minute you get non-linear stuff in the systems, they're not guaranteed solvable. But that's the kind of mathematical end of complexity. The other problem, Patrick, is that there isn't this one size fits all. There isn't a suddenly we can turn it into maths and isolate it. It's not. It's kind of more underpinning than that.
I think behavioural complexity, for example, you have to somewhat step back from the concepts of mathematical complexity and somehow look at how do you look at this behaviour of this complex mass. Is it about emergence? Well, a lot of the definitions out there that are coming out of organisations like the Santa Fe Institute talk about emergence as the key defining thing for...
So what's emergence?
Emergence is that we have a set of behaviours, a set of inputs, but the result is not in accordance with what you would have had expected. So it's that whole thing of the outcomes of the many is actually far in excess of what is expected from those things that were inputs into the process.
Yeah, and the problem becomes that once it's happened, once the surprise has happened, you can explain it away with hindsight. You can make sense of it.
But you can't
But you
predict
could
it.
never have anticipated it.
Yeah.
You can't predict
Yeah.
it.
Well, you can't anticipate. You don't anticipate it. And this is why Taleb called them black swans, because he was coming from a Northern Hemisphere perspective and regarded the discovery of black swans as being something that everybody knew swans were white. And they came to Perth and found they were black.
So, what do you mean? So, can you explain exactly what a black swan event is?
It's one that wasn't predicted. It's outside the prediction space. So the classic example, and you can do this as a test if we wanted to. What are let's have some predictions for what are going to be the surprises of the next decade. What's going to be the biggest surprise in the next decade? Haven't they run out of surprises? So has somebody got a candidate for the biggest? Okay, now think about the question.
No, hang on.
Yeah?
Whether machines can be conscious or not.
Well, is that a surprise or a question?
It will be a surprise when we know the answer.
Yeah. So conscious machines will be a surprise. Well, they've been anticipated for a long time.
Maybe if you can't have them, it'll be a surprise. So maybe if you can't have them, it'll be a surprise.
Yeah, well,
So maybe technology and where it'll end up going, how we'll end up actually integrating it and maybe transhumanism, something that we haven't foreseen, that some sort of bonding with technology, maybe.
Yeah.
I think by definition we can't. But by definition we can't predict what the surprise is going to be, because then there wouldn't be a surprise.
But the point really then is, after that question, ask what were the biggest surprises of the last 10 years.
Well, maybe an accurate question would be, what do you think the general population would be surprised
Yeah, now what were, historically over the last decade, what were the surprises? And what you find by asking those questions in a bit more controlled way than we have now is that there is a difference in kind between the ones that people talk about as future surprises and the ones they talk about as past surprises. Past surprises really were
Berlin Wall.
9/11.
Berlin
That's
Wall was
not within the last 10 years.
Yeah, but
That's what
no,
I
the last
thought.
9/11 was just within.
Yeah.
The current events in the Arab world certainly would.
GFC.
Yeah, GFC.
Yeah, GFC is probably the biggest of all. Yeah.
I guess the Mayan thing fits in with those sorts of things. They're a bit, disastrous. The Mayan end of the world 2012 thing.
That not happening, will that be a surprise? Yeah.
I would just venture a comment.
Hello?
Possibly some of those.
One person at a time. We have someone with a microphone here.
All right.
Hello. My question goes back a little bit there. To the extent that we use scientific language and form a part of the culture of science, we tend to take it for granted that we can communicate, that our words communicate their intended meaning to their audience. But within the wider culture, the traditional culture, which philosophy is a part, this doesn't seem to be the case. Do we need to ask ontological questions like, what kind of thing is a word? What kind of thing is the definition of a word?
Do you mind if I comment? You raise a really interesting question there, and anyone who's across what's happening in the web with what's called the ontological movement in the web context, it's actually trying to address those problems. But how do you, in an environment where the use of language is moving as quickly as it is, actually try and put some ontological basis on the meaning of a word? It's a really complex problem. This whole issue of ontology and the meaning of words, to actually be able to convey the sense of what you're actually trying to say. I mean, I mentioned in my presentation Wittgenstein, and much of what he wrote doesn't actually translate very well to English at all. But there was an intention with what he had said and the way that he used words that we struggle to actually try and grasp and use in some way to actually see what his intention was in what he wrote. But let me add to that the complicating factor that the current young generation is rewriting the use of the English language to actually make it akin to what you see in texting and so on. So all of those things come together to say, what is a word and how do I convey what it means?
Well, I don't think it's an interesting question at all, actually. And I say that a bit provocatively. But the reason why I say that is that I think if you really want to grapple with these issues, you have to use the tools that we've got available. And the tools that we've got available as humans is language. Now, it may be imprecise, but I think you're going down the wrong rabbit hole if you start putting a lot of time and effort into going round in circles about what is the meaning of a word. What is the meaning of meaning? What is the meaning of the meaning of the meaning of the word? It just doesn't go anywhere. So my preference, I mean, I understand that people might find that fascinating. My preference is much more practical and pragmatic. Let's use the tools that we've got, imprecise as they are, including language, including words, including other ways of trying to get across what we're actually thinking or feeling, being images or music or art or all sorts of ways of communicating with one another to actually move the action forwards, rather than going round in circles and down rabbit holes that don't go anywhere. It's my view.
How do you explain the inexplicable with the tools that we have? If the tools that we have are limited.
Well, I don't think they are limited, but that's why I think this complexity theory seems to me, from a naive perspective anyway, to be the doorway into explaining what appears now to be inexplicable. I don't believe eventually that it will be inexplicable, but I think it appears to be inexplicable to us now.
But what changes is the growth of language and the expansion of our toolkit, surely, in order to make that progress.
Sure. We will invent, we will create new words in order to be able to describe the new concepts that are coming about.
Yeah, we also talk through YouTube. Whenever we've got anything that really matters to say, we do it through YouTube nowadays. Because you just simply can't compress everything into words anymore. And you need the images as well to actually say anything and be understood. You need to back up the words with images.
I'd like to ask you what you foresee as the predictive capabilities of these complexity theories.
The predictive capability of what?
Of these complexity theories.
Well, one of the points is that it gives you only, it kind of sets limits on what you can predict. That's the point of it. It says, if you keep relying on predictive methods, you don't get the story. So allow in your planning and you're driving everything to the last percentage point of efficiency that you're going to kill everybody sometime, because you're going to make systems that are so efficient that there is no resilience, there is no space for reaction. So you basically, there are more generic lessons is to leave defensive space, to allow that things can collapse, to allow that there is something that can make play. I mean, we all know the US is bankrupt, but the US has bailed out everybody else that's bankrupt. The economy itself hasn't got a lot of flexibility left in it. It's probably, the economy may not have another decade left in it, as it is. But we don't know for sure. We might bumble on a bit more. Can I just say, the one bit of hope that I would give is that the open source movement, which is extended to open this, open that, alters the game. Clearly, two-party democracy is past its use-by date because it's imploded, it's reactionary, it's giving no leadership. But the open source movement and the extended open movement is the example of what we can do collectively, what can emerge from a collective of human beings. And you can't predict what it's going to deliver next. But it certainly eventually broke the Microsoft monopoly.
So we've got time for one more quick question.
Can I just make one quick point as a quick follow-on? One of the things that does worry me about complexity and the use of the term right now is it's somewhat like the concept of God being used as some sort of epistemological putty that we stick into things that we don't understand. That is tending to happen with the concept of complexity, that it's another form of epistemological putty that we shove into some hole and say, oh, this is a really complex problem when we really don't understand, and it's all about emergence and so on because we really can't predict it.
Yeah.
So anybody hasn't asked a question yet?
Down here?
Okay, go in the front with the hi. Any question?
Oh,
Oh.
well. Yeah, there was a question there about past surprises and future surprises. I would just make a comment that just because a larger group does not know something is going to happen or exists, that doesn't mean that there's a human being on this planet that doesn't know. Because most of the time, every black swan, every anomaly you could ever think of, someone knew about it before it happened.
Yeah. Now
They certainly know about it at the moment it happens, even before you do. Even with the internet.
Now we've got 7 billion people playing the forecasting game. Some of them are going to be right some of the time.
Absolutely.
But a lot of them are going to be wrong a lot of the time.
Correct. That's right. So it's how you
Choose.
search for truth, and there are some people, some human beings, that are much better at searching for truth than others. That's a fact.
Well, that seems to me a bit like playing the stock market. How do you choose?
Some people are better at it than others.
And how do you know?
Some people are better at it than others.
And how do you know?
Because they're the ones with all the money.
Well, Tarmac,
Well,
would
no,
argue
not
that a lot
necessarily.
of them have a lot of money simply because of luck. I mean, that was one of the points
You
of his
believe in
book.
luck? Pure luck?
Yes, I mean, his first book was called Fooled by
No
Randomness.
chance.
Yeah, his first book was called Fooled by Randomness and makes a strong case.
Sure.
As Tony said,
It's all luck? Life is all luck?
Not all.
No, that's not what he said. That's not what he said.
the ability to predict, to know.
Can't hear what you're saying.
Yeah.
But this time, without the complete knowledge of your environment, anyway, you're not going to know you're right until it happens.
Yeah.
Okay, one more.
I just wanted to add a comment to this discussion. Every week somebody predicts lottery numbers, and that's the evidence of that is that somebody wins it. High because they have a successful strategy for picking.
Okay, Jeff Lee.
Hi.
Hi.
Just the issue of public education about what complexity is and unpredictability in principle. It would seem to me that the weather forecasts would be a prime example of where you could run public education. And instead of having not 4-day, but 7-day forecasts, the people who understand complexity full well are the weather forecasters, the scientists down at the Bureau. Instead of just having 7-day forecasts that everyone understands are less reliable the further out you get, you actually wrap around that kind of longer term forecast some kind of concept that, it's decidedly less predictable the further out you go. And in fact, we see events in our systems, in our simulated systems, that in fact mean that 7-day forecasting in this instance is probably just bungled. Anyway, I just think that that's one example where you easily have public education.
Well, it's a nice illustration, but look at the difficulty that we have convincing the general public, and everybody in this room is not part of the general public, about climate change.
Sure. The weather forecasts, I think, I just think I think most people
It's more
understand
intuitive.
the concept of probability. There's a 50% chance it's going to rain tomorrow. It's a simple enough mathematical concept that everyone gets.
Yes.
Even the scientifically
and sociologically or psychologically, people will use that as a good example and they'll accept it, but they won't necessarily make the transition to apply that understanding to a different arena.
True.
Yeah, I blogged about this fairly recently. I felt that the cyclone in Queensland proved that we actually are taking notice of that stuff to a greater degree, even than we were on Black Saturday. Black Saturday, a lot of people didn't want to listen, so they didn't change their behaviour, from the police minister, from the police commissioner down. But I think the fact that only one person died directly as a result of that, a cyclone that was as big as Katrina and as well forecast as Katrina, we have learnt a bit in the last few years. Now, maybe that learning gets lost quickly. That's the interesting question over the next 5 years as to whether we lose the learning. But at least early this year, we had very reliable faith in forecasting and justified.
I've got a question that is trying to bring into the conversation something a little more mainstream about the idea of complexity and emergence, and kind of bounces off what we were talking with stock markets and where is the truth. Where does all the theory around wisdom of the crowds and Malcolm Gladwell's work about the tipping point and blink and the outliers, where does that fit within that construct? And for economics, to add one in there.
Haven't read the book, so can't. I haven't read that book, so I can't directly comment on it. But I do know a bit about the stock market, and what I know is that there are various ways of predictably doing well in the stock market, and they're well known, but it's about risk, and it's about probability, and it's about length of time in the market rather than timing. It's time in the market, not timing of the market. And those people who say that they might be able to choose the outliers, maybe they can, but it's a risk-return trade-off. So sometimes they win, sometimes they don't. The further you go out, the more it's like gambling.
I suppose part of why I brought up the stock market and was into the crowds is because it's been shown that when the Space Shuttle Columbia exploded, within less than 24 hours, the company that was responsible for that explosion, being the company that created the O-rings, the stock market had already decided within 24 hours the two potential people, and within 48 hours of that, who it exactly was. But yet it took a 9-month inquiry to find out.
Yes, but one is using the power of information technology to move rumour around much more quickly than it has in the past. The other is a political process. So, very different arenas of human activity.
And the reality is we do need processes that slow things down. We don't need to run at full potential. I mean, we've proved that. The stock market's had brakes put on it on the automated trading stuff, because automated trading causes disasters.
Okay, that's enough. We've run out of time for questions. We've got a quick presentation on some old technology, and Craig Pierce is going